I'm Grim.
I'm Zolgar. That's Kaiju.
And this is Two Idiots and a Dog, Idiots on Film,
where we explore movies that we love
or think are important for pop culture. This week we look at Pacific Rim.
So, we chose Pacific Rim for a couple of reasons. First, it's probably obvious by what I named my dog, but I am a big fan of Kaiju movies. I literally named my dog after a genre. And of course, Grim also sort of likes Kaiju movies-ish.
Yeah, they're okay, I guess.
But Pacific Rim ended up winning out over a couple other options, including the original Godzilla and the, I believe, 2016 American Godzilla from Legendary, which I also actually really love that one, and we will do it eventually, but that's beside the point. Because ultimately, I really feel like Pacific Rim is one of, if not the best, American-made kaiju movies ever. And because of the work Del Toro put into it, it even holds up compared to many of the Japanese kaiju movies. Grim actually kind of put it best earlier in the note session.
You want giant robots punching monsters? We got you. You want more? Guillermo Del Toro is in the corner, opening a long coat like the merchant from Resident Evil 4, with character interplay, growth and dynamics, commentary on avoiding your problems, and plenty of respect women juice. What you need.
By the way, that is Resident Evil 4, the video game, not the fourth movie, which doesn't have the merchant.
Before we get into Pacific Rim, here's a word from our sponsor. Hey, Zolgar. We should start thinking about the future of Two Idiots and a Dog.
We should, but that takes effort.
And we are just a couple of idiots. We shouldn't be allowed to decide anything.
Got a great idea. Let's sucker our listeners into doing the thinking for us.
Okay, but how would that work?
Simple. Listener survey.
That's so stupid, it might just work.
If you like what we do, we would love to hear your thoughts on the future of Two Idiots and a Dog. We've put together a listener survey, less than 20 questions about the future of the project.
All questions are optional, and we don't collect any personal information.
It should only take a few minutes of your time, and you can help make Two Idiots and a Dog better.
You can find a link to the survey in the description of this episode.
You can also find it on our social media pages and Discord server. Alright, so I think the first thing we have to talk about with Pacific Rim, and it's probably the only real problem I have with this movie, and that is the name of the primary Jaeger.
Yeah.
We are going to refrain from using the full name of the Jaeger for the duration of this podcast. We will simply call the primary Jaeger Danger, because the first word in its name is a slur towards the Romani people. And honestly, I kind of miss not knowing that word was a slur. I don't miss using it and inadvertently hurting people, of course, but I do need to mention that the version used in this movie is spelled differently and is actually a reference to a antique airplane engine that was originally produced in the 1920s and is still made today for restored vintage aircraft. But that doesn't change the impact that Jaeger's name has on certain people.
I agree. And I was ahead of the curve on this a little bit because around this time I was my partner was someone of Romani descent, so I was already aware of this, but it wasn't as widespread awareness as we have right now on the internet. Like, somebody even breathes this word, you've got 6 people now popping up, which I think is great, by the way. Holding our culture accountable for the attempted normalization of slurs is great. I'm glad that it happens. Some of you might want to be a little more respectful about pointing that out. Just a heads up, but that's a bit of a digression. So, as Zolgar stated, we will be referring to the primary Jaeger as Danger. And just continue to hope that people become more aware of the fact that the first part of that name is a slur. That said, the reference they were trying to make with the name is pretty cool and interesting, especially because it plays into the visual design of Danger a little bit.
Yeah, each Jaeger we see has its own unique signature design. You know, you've got Cherno Alpha, it's named after Chernobyl, if you're not familiar, if not aware, and it is designed to have aesthetics reminiscent of a nuclear reactor. Or, sorry, I should say a nuclear power plant, which, amusingly, one of the primary aesthetics of that, the Chernobyl plant didn't have. It didn't have the large vent stacks.
It did not. It had a slightly different design from what we think of when we think of a nuclear power plant these days. But the visual design of the Jaegers themselves, as you said, were varied.
That actually reminds me of something. The Australian mech, Striker Eureka, I think that was its name. That was originally designed to be our protagonist mech. And they kind of decided that it was just a little too clean, a little too perfect. It kind of like Stormtrooper armor.
Yeah,
it has that just almost pure look that we kind of start associating with evil.
Yeah, and they do mention that part of that is because it is a newer system.
It is the first and last Mark V.
Yep. Which, the fact that they do bring up the generational differences throughout the film, I think, was great. So we've got these... There's so many other mech properties where you have specific models or frames that are clearly differentiated. But a lot of your main systems are still more or less identical. Just as a brief aside, not to get us too much of a tangent here, but take a look at something like Gundam, where most of the mobile suit designs are in close proximity to each other. There's some times where you have to actually double check what paint job something is rocking in order to properly identify it. That is not the case here. Each of these Jaegers have their own unique profile that you can pick out from miles out.
Yeah, and the same is even true in the other Pacific Rim properties. Every Jaeger is a unique design, just like every Kaiju is a unique design.
And the fact that they went through and took the time to design these different mech systems is really cool, as well as, like you just mentioned, the various Kaiju. Like, no two Kaiju are identical. We see similarities, and that similarity is explained throughout the movie, but they are still very different, with different behavior and different tactics and different capabilities.
And again, that is also carried through in the other properties. You know, we're not getting too much into those, but there is so much world building in this entire franchise that I could spend a lot of time talking about it, and I'm not going to.
Yeah, honestly, we could do an entire episode on just the designs, and maybe we'll do a spin-off series at some point that touches on the designs of stuff like this from different franchises, but that will not be today. The designs are great, and the tech that goes into those designs is equally great, even if some of the premise is a little flawed.
There's one thing that, before we break off of design, has to be mentioned.
Yep.
And that is Del Toro's insistence that all of the Kaiju be designed such that they could be a guy in a suit.
They weren't, but they could have been.
Also, and as an aside, you will notice I always refer to him as Del Toro. That is because I cannot pronounce his first name. I know how it's pronounced, but I can't make my tongue work that way.
Which is unfortunate. Might have to work on that with you a little bit, because we're going to be doing a lot of his movies.
I'll just do what the kid who played young Mako did. Totoro-san.
Oh, I love that little anecdote from set. All right. I have a final note on design, and it's a bit of a critique. So don't be wrong, I still love the designs. Jaeger, Kaiju, everything. Even the military base. Where this
the pilot armor.
Great, believable combination of sci-fi tech and tried and true military industrial bunker. Like, it worked. But my one critique is this. Maybe you shouldn't put your cockpit in the most punchable part of your robot.
Really, you should put your cockpit like in the robot's groin or something.
Okay, Zone of the Enders.
So the only way you're going to have a problem is if something decides to kick you in the nuts. You really don't want it to be something that, oh, I don't know, your enemy can wrap a big tail around and crush and rip off. I'm looking at you, Crimson Typhoon.
Yeah, don't be wrong though. Still fun. Suspension of disbelief still in effect because it's a kaiju movie and nothing needs to make sense. Kaiju are, by definition, impossible.
Yes, she is.
Lucky she's cute, too. So, the designs are not the only visual elements in the movie, though, that are really interesting, because we have some of the special effects are really great. They hold up. There's no special effect in the film that pulls them out. Even the completely unbelievable stuff, like the danger being thrown, like 3 blocks across the water and into the harbor.
So, would you like to know how they did those effects to make them look so realistic?
I believe he gave everybody instruction to treat them like they had weight.
Not just that, but they built miniature scale sets, and a lot of their stuff was made with actual material. Like, their rocks and such were real giant fucking rocks.
Mm-hmm.
But when they did things for, like, parts flying around, they would do things, they build the set in slightly miniature, in miniature scale, but not like super miniature scale.
Uh-huh.
And they would basically use a green dummy to represent the thing so you'd actually see it hitting things. That's what they did for the sequence in the fight in Hong Kong when they're going after the one that's chasing Newt, and Danger punches for the kaiju but misses and goes through a building and destroys a bunch of stuff and then taps the desk with the Newton's cradle.
Mm-hmm.
They had that set built in miniature, and they basically put a green screen ramrod through it and then did Danger's fist and arm over that ramrod.
Yeah, and Del Toro's always been one to combine those practical and special effects together, and it shows in his work, and I think it makes his work quality. And it definitely paid off here, where everything just feels real, even though it's doing impossible things. Like, there is no universe we live in where a creature that size can not only fly, but carry something the size and weight of Danger with it. Not happening.
There's no universe where something the size and weight of Danger can be thrown that far, that fast. There is no universe in which we exist that something the size of Danger can be dropped from that kind of height and not only intact, or remain intact, but not liquefy any organic material inside of it on impact.
Yeah. And, like we said, these are things that we all just take for granted and accept because kaiju movie.
Yeah.
Kaiju are, by definition, impossible. So once we've already hit that point, a lot of other stuff we're just like, yeah, okay, yeah, no, that works. This is fine. Even as we can sit here and nitpick and go, that wouldn't work, and that wouldn't work, or that wouldn't work. And I think that's one of the cool things about this movie is we do have this amazing blend of the physics that are actually accurate and the physics that are 100% Hollywood. And the way they're blended together works really well in this movie.
Also, regarding, the kind of science and pseudoscience of this whole thing, I think that's actually a good segue for us into the characters with going for the science team.
Yeah, our science team are a couple of absolute dorks.
Who are polar opposites.
We've got the stuffy, stiff upper lip, proper academic in Gottlieb.
Who is also great.
Love it. And then we've got the wild, mad scientist.
Kaiju groupie.
In the character of Newt. And their dynamic together is great. But really we have to bring them up because their dynamic and playing off of each other gives us some very important story moments that set us up for our payoff with the other main characters. And I want to touch real quick on a few other side characters real quick before we get into the main characters. All of the Jaeger pilots are defined. They're not just generic guy in a flight suit. We've got the Russians who are very visually distinct from everybody else.
And we have them established as a husband and wife team.
We also have the triplets.
Which, first of all, the fact that they decided to make one of the Jaegers piloted by 3 people when all the others are piloted by 2. And imagine for a moment a 3-way drift.
Yeah, it's really cool that they put that in there. And then we start getting into the characters who are a little more integral. We've got Stacker Pentecost, who we meet briefly in the opening, but we don't really know who he is or what he's about beyond brass.
He is a hard-nosed, experienced military commander who knows what he is doing and has zero patience for the bureaucratic nonsense that the world governments are trying to shove down his throat.
Yeah. And then as the story progresses, we learn more about him and we learn why he's this way, especially when talking to Mako, one of our 2 main characters. And we kind of understand a little bit of his relationship with our other main protagonist, Raleigh, who is also our primary perspective character for most of the movie, where we kind of start to understand that dynamic, but we don't really know what's going on with him and Mako until well into the movie. We can kind of start picking it up, and when you've watched this before, you've got the context for everything, it makes sense. But a lot of that in the moment first viewing context is given to you solely by his performance and the performance of Mako's actress, Rinko. Pentecost is, of course, played by Idris Elba.
Who is amazing, and I will watch him in literally anything.
And before we start getting into the main characterization that we absolutely have to go over, I do want a brief aside about one specific scene that really plays off the characterizations of Pentecost and Mako. And they do a great job of letting you know context without letting you know context in how the characters are acting, that way the actors are portraying, the look in certain eyes, and it's summed up in 2 words said by Pentecost. Get ready. In which he is telling her, yes, it's time, she's going to pilot. And then we're immediately given the context for that in her memories, which we can touch on in a little bit here. But just that characterization, that depth of emotion, me having the full context from having watched this previously, I teared up this viewing. I admit it. I'm a sap.
You're not the only one.
But you don't even need that full context to feel the weight of the emotions in that scene because it is acted, directed, and shot perfectly.
Yeah. Right, and of course, in mentioning supporting characters, while he really doesn't add much of anything to the story, we do just have to mention Tendo because he is just such a fun character, and
we also have to throw in a quick nod to someone going into the movie the first time I didn't even know was on the cast, because he's not a main character, and normally when you see him, he's a main character.
Ron Perlman.
As Hannibal Chow.
Which is the stupidest name ever.
And he admits it freely in character.
Yeah, they bloody well hung a lantern on it.
It was great. But we don't really have... We could talk about all of these characters and their characterizations and what they add and bring to the movie pretty much all night.
There is something I think we need to mention about Hannibal Chow.
Okay.
And that, because it does play into the story, he does become relevant to the story for something that Newt is involved in, something extremely stupid that's also super important to the story. But he also is the vehicle for a certain amount of world building that, while it doesn't add anything to the main story, it builds the world for us in this idea that there is now an entire financial ecosystem around the kaiju.
Yeah, and that is interesting. And again, we could sit here and talk about it all night, but...
We really don't have the time for that.
We really don't, yeah. And we need to get into the primary characterization. The most important characterizations throughout the whole movie. Real quick before that, we have to touch on two non-primary Jaeger pilots. And that is Herc and Chuck Hansen. You know, Herc is this veteran, Chuck is his upstart son. Chuck ends up taking on the role of our rival antagonist a little bit. Never strays into full villain territory. He's still definitely on the same side, but he doesn't agree with Raleigh and Mako being there and being on the team. He sees them as a liability, and he makes no qualms about that.
Yeah, Chuck Hansen, played very well by Robert Kaczynski, was... He was very antagonistic to Raleigh and Mako because he saw Raleigh as a washed-up has-been and Mako as, you know, this nobody new recruit, you know. And, of course, from his perspective, you can understand how that is because Raleigh's been out of the game for 5 years, and the last time Raleigh was in a Jaeger... The Jaeger was nearly destroyed. One of the two pilots was killed. So you can kind of understand how this, you know, hot upstart piloting a Mark V would feel that this Mark III pilot from 5 years ago doesn't really matter anymore.
Yeah. He is absolutely not diplomatic about it in any way, though. He is, in fact, a jerk. And... Again, Rob Kaczynski played him perfectly in that role. There's only one scene where they come to blows, and those blows only happen because he started going after Mako instead of Raleigh, and Raleigh's just like, apologize to her. Like, he doesn't even care about himself. He's like, apologize to her.
Yeah, doesn't he say something to the effect of something about, like, some need to be kept on a leash or something like that?
And then Raleigh just lays into him, like...
And whoops his something fierce, showing that, yeah, he's a bit of a has-been, but he's...
And we already know that he still can fight because we saw the compatibility drift candidate tests where they had a bunch of dudes go up against him, and he just floored them all.
And, of course, Mako pointed out that on all of them, he could have won sooner.
Yep. And Chuck ultimately goes out like a true Jaeger pilot.
Yeah, I have a little bit of an issue with the scene where Chuck goes out, but at the same time, the fact that he willingly goes with Pentecost on what he is fairly certain is a suicide mission. And then when their Jaeger is disabled and they can't complete the mission as intended, they're like, we're going to clear a path. And, you know, he turns to Pentecost and says, it's been an honor serving with you, sir. And when we see that scene happening with this character who is our asshole antagonist, and it still chokes you up.
Yeah. there's lots of things they could have just absolutely just let slide with these characterizations, and they didn't. There's before they even go out, there's a touching scene between Herc and Chuck where they're saying goodbye to each other because they both know. They're both Jaeger pilots. They know the stakes, and they know Chuck's not coming back.
Yeah, that scene, because, Herc acknowledges that, he's been a single father. He has been solely responsible for raising this kid and knows he screwed up. And when he says to Chuck something to the effect of, I don't want to regret the things I never said.
And Chuck is like, you don't have to say them. I know.
Because they
were in the drift.
They've been spending years in each other's heads.
Yeah. And that's what they did with our antagonist. So now we get to talk about the single most important character interplay and dynamic in the entire movie. And we have to touch on this. I know we've spent a lot of time talking about our characterizations up until this point, but please bear with us, because this next one is the character dynamic, the relationship that needs to be talked about.
I thought we already talked about Newton Gottlieb.
I'm talking about Mako and Raleigh.
Oh, they don't matter. Those characters are totally unimportant to the story.
So they did a few things here that were really cool. Raleigh himself, you first meet him in the opening when he's still young and cocky. And you're just straight up like, oh, great. We're just going to get white boy protagonist. Super. And then they do an abrupt, sharp turn on us with how that prologue goes, which is bad for him. And we jump ahead, and he's 5 years later. He's seasoned. He's had 5 years to reflect on what happened. He almost doesn't go with Pentecost.
Yeah, he tries to turn it down, and Pentecost is just like, dude, the world's ending. Do you want to die here in a hole, or do you want to die in a Jaeger?
Yeah. And so it's kind of cool because Raleigh comes in and we start the movie and we're expecting him to be the cocksure young punk kind of, and no, in many ways, by the time we actually are spending time with him in the main story of the film, he is in many respects a not quite wise old mentor, but he's very well seasoned.
Yeah.
And he brings a lot of wisdom and philosophy to the story. And then we have Mako, who is our young upstart, but she doesn't carry herself that way. There's a little bit of that impulsive fire in her character, but it's very tightly reined in because she's been raised by one of the greats, Pentecost. And she knows firsthand, for being raised by one of the most celebrated pilots ever, exactly what goes into this. And it's very much a thing where Pentecost doesn't want her piloting. And that's a recurring theme through first part of our real main story is she wants to go out and pilot, and she's definitely qualified for it with a perfect score in the simulation, 51 simulations, 51 simulated kills, which is insane. But he's still holding back, and one of the main things is Raleigh seeing her, and they start kind of having this, they're circling each other a little bit, sizing each other up, and there's almost that point where we're like, oh yeah, it's going to be romantic, and then it isn't. You could read it romantic if you wanted to, but you don't have to. And the one scene in particular that really feels like it would have been the sexy romantic interest moment is when Raleigh takes his shirt off.
Now, there's one thing I want to get back to really quick before we go into their dynamic. And that is specifically that, honestly, up until the point we get to in the movie, I don't think Pentecost was wrong about not wanting her to pilot and thinking she wasn't ready. She had perfect scores, but I don't think she was ready to pilot without somebody like Raleigh who would help her to understand the physical and emotional toll that this actually takes.
Yeah. And I'm not going to say you're wrong. Raleigh is definitely what was needed for her to become a pilot. But getting back to this real quick, he's got his shirt off, and you're all like, okay, she's going to ogle him. And she does. She stops. She pauses. She stares. And then the camera pans over, and we see why. The scars burned into his flesh from that fight in Alaska. And it continues to be this thing where their relationship develops in such a way that you're sitting there going, you're fully expecting the full bore, all aboard the romance train, and it never happens. You can read it romantically, but you don't need to. And everything that is actually shown is platonic. It's a close, intimate platonic relationship, but it's platonic. And where we see this the most is definitely the best scene in the whole movie as far as I'm concerned. And that is where, during the drift compatibility testing, she selects all these candidates for him. He wipes the floor with them. She critiques him. And he straight up calls her out to come. And Pentecost is like, no. And Raleigh fights him on it. And finally he relents. And what proceeds is what Raleigh really described it as it's a conversation, not a fight. Because even though they are fighting with these staffs and there is banter, that's not the conversation. The banter is not the conversation. It's the flow of movement as they're moving around each other and everything. And finally, at the end of it, he looks straight at Pentecost and like, she's the one. And so many other movies, that would have been absolutely, they would have ratcheted up the sexual tension in that, and they did not do that.
Yeah, they didn't ratchet up the sexual tension there. And even at the scene where in basically every movie ever they would have gone into it, that closing scene where Raleigh and Mako are on the escape pod, just kind of sitting there waiting for pickup, and they're close, they're holding each other, their foreheads are together, and it's just this really touching, intimate moment that every other movie on the freaking planet would have had them kissing.
Yep.
Because, attractive male lead, attractive female lead. Now kiss.
And we didn't get that, but what we got was just as intimate and personal.
It was more intimate and personal, really.
Yeah, but it wasn't a, ooh, I'm into you. It was, oh my God, we survived that. How?
We survived that. We saved the world. We are alive. Holy shit.
Yeah, and there's so many story beats throughout this that are great and wonderful, and these characterizations definitely support them. And there's even moments that shouldn't work and do just because of the actors involved. Like, today we're canceling the apocalypse is the corniest fucking line out of anybody's mouth but Idris Elba's.
Well, that is Idris Elba for you.
Yeah.
And Idris Elba is the man who stole the line, I'm Black Superman.
Yeah. One of my other favorite lines out of the whole movie is his, and that is, 1, don't you ever touch me again. 2, don't you ever touch me again. Like, again, out of anybody else, it would be very hard to take that seriously, but coming from Idris Elba, in a character who's been built up as this authority figure on this military base, he makes it work. Like, these other story moments and story beats come together to form a very complex narrative. Like I said earlier, if you just want monsters getting punched by robots, this movie's got you covered. If you want more, it is here, waiting for you. I honestly think that this is one of those films that you don't truly appreciate unless you watch it at least twice.
Yeah, it's because the first time you watch it, you're gonna get distracted by the big shiny robot fights because they're awesome.
They really are. I mean, the fight with Otachi, I can never remember the other one's name, but that fight with was it EMP King Kong knockoff and the big flying guy.
Was the other one Leatherback? Was it Otachi and Leatherback?
I think it might have been Otachi and Leatherback, or Leatherback was later. Either way, But like that fight was amazing on multiple fronts, even with the tragedy of losing 2 Jaeger teams.
Well, that's part of what made it so amazing.
And then
is the fact that we watch these things destroy 2 Jaeger teams, kick the ass of a third, and then we get to watch Danger come in and stomp both of them.
Yeah, and it's really great. So what we have here is, I keep bringing this up when we do these, but we have this perfect, wonderful blend of, we've got our visuals and our design, our characterizations, our story and our dialogue, and they're all coming together to build something stronger than the sum of its parts.
Now, there's one other thing that really plays into it, and I never brought it up in my notes, but because you were mentioning it so much, I actually really noticed it this time around, and that is the music.
The music is perfect. So the music for this was composed by, I am going to slaughter this pronunciation, I apologize profusely, Ramin Djawadi. If you are like, hey, that's a really weird name that sounds familiar, it's because he did the score for Game of Thrones and a whole bunch of other great movies. And then they took it a step further. Those really crunchy guitar riffs, especially on like the main theme and some of the other tracks, are by a very well-known guitarist. Tom Morello, better known for his work on a little band called Rage Against the Machine.
Never heard of him.
So you've got a really good composer with at least one really great guitarist, and then all the other musicians involved. I don't know all their names, but this just creates this really great soundtrack that it's soft and serene and tragic when it needs to be, and then right as we're getting ready to ramp up, that kicks in, and you're just like, whoa, okay, it's about to get real.
And I honestly, I need to go through it again, paying even more attention, but I think there is subtle differences to the music for every Jaeger.
A little bit, yeah. I wouldn't be surprised if it actually was fully different for each one of them.
Because I swear that when Cherno Alpha's on, there's an almost Russian, kind of like traditional Russian dance sound to it, versus what you get at some of the other ones. So I kind of want to go through and listen to that.
Yeah, and then you've also got, like, every time Danger makes a grand entrance, everything opens. I don't know if it's supposed to be like a horn call from the Jaeger or not, but there's that gong, and then the music picks up. The sound design was perfect for what this movie needed. Everything was exactly what it should have been. And speaking of sounds, there is, in fact, a really cool voice Easter egg.
So, you may notice that Danger's AI sounds a bit familiar. And that is because Del Toro is a giant nerd.
Huge nerd.
The voice actress who provided the voice for Danger's AI is none other than Ellen McLean. Which, if you don't recognize that name, that was Gladys from Portal. And Del Toro approached Valve wanting to use Gladys's voice for the AI in this.
Yeah, which is a great detail. It's amazing that, one, that he got permission to do that, and two, I love her voice, especially as an AI system. Now, this isn't a one-for-one GLaDOS. I believe you mentioned they use a slightly different filter.
Yeah.
The performance isn't as emotive. It's very more flatline, your car GPS talking to you. But it's perfect and a lovely little nod to her previous work. And again, greater than the sum of its parts. It's a fantastic movie. But there is one thing. One most important detail about this movie.
And that is that the dog survives.
The Hanson's dog, Max, is never even in danger once in this entire movie.
That is not true. The dog is in danger during the drift test. But it's not directly in danger.
Yeah, that's true. Although, why were you doing a drift test on a live weapon system?
I'm going to blame the fact that they had no time and they didn't have as much oversight as they needed, so they were cutting corners.
Yeah, I guess that works. And, importantly of all, Max was fine.
Max was fine.
That's it for this week. Thank you for listening to Two Idiots and a Dog.
If you like what we do, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/TIAAD Media.
That's TIAAD Media, all one word. If you want to send Kaiju fan mail or reach out to the idiots for anything, you can email us at tiaadmedia@gmail.com.
Again, that is tiaadmedia@gmail.com. You can also join us on Discord. Links can be found on Patreon in our email signature and on our SoundCloud page.
We would also like to give a special thank you to all of our patrons on Patreon.
Especially these idiots.
Random Warrior and Rain.
If you want to hear your name included here, you can support us at the Honorary Idiot tier on Patreon.